My daughter brought home a boy who smiled like the man who stole my father's life, framed him for a crime he didn't commit, watched him rot in prison, and never lost a single night of sleep over it, until now. He set his fork down the way confident people do, slowly, deliberately, like the pause itself was a statement. Started with nothing, Preston Whitmore said. Worked my way up through tough decisions, a few painful ones. But that's what builds character, right? He looked straight at me when he said it. I held his gaze. My wine glass was in my hand and I was gripping it harder than I needed to. Across the table, my daughter Ivy was nodding, glowing, completely at ease in the home of the man who had destroyed everything I grew up with. She had no idea. How could she? She was 23. She knew her grandfather as a quiet man with kind eyes who died before she was old enough to understand what his silence meant. Absolutely, I said. Tough decisions shape us. Preston smiled, not at the words, at something behind them, a private acknowledgement that only the two of us were having. His wife Diane refilled her glass. Their son Colton, my daughter's boyfriend of 4 months, reached over and touched Ivy's hand. He was charming in the way that well-raised, well-resourced boys often are. Easy smile, good posture, the right questions at the right moments. But sitting there, watching him watch Ivy, I felt something cold settle in my chest that hadn't been there when we walked in. It had started 3 hours ago, when the front door of this enormous house swung open and I saw Preston Whitmore's face for the first time in 23 years. Recognition had moved through me like ice water. He knew, instantly, and he covered it in less than a second. "You must be Amanda," he'd said, extending his hand. "So wonderful to finally meet you." I had shaken it. I don't know how. Reflex, maybe. Or the shock of the moment being so much larger than I'd expected, even though I had spent the entire 40-minute drive preparing for exactly this. Now, at dinner, watching him perform generosity and warmth for my daughter, I thought about my father, about the last time I had seen him truly happy. I thought about a specific Saturday in October 1999, when I was 14 years old and my dad came home from a business trip smiling, carrying a paper bag of pastries from a bakery in Chicago, saying the deal had gone through, saying things were going to change for us, saying Preston had come through again. He used to say that about Preston. Preston came through. Preston always comes through. He was right, just not the way he meant. My father's name was Gerald Reyes. He was 41 years old in the fall of 1999, and he had spent the better part of a decade building a logistics and supply chain consulting company called Reyes Whitmore Partners with his college roommate and best friend, Preston Whitmore. They had met freshman year at the University of Illinois in 1980. My dad was the son of a Mexican-American truck driver from Cicero. Preston was from Winnetka, private school, a family that already had money. By all logic, they should not have been friends. But my dad always said Preston was different back then. Hungry, wanting to prove himself against the money he'd grown up with rather than coasting on it. My dad respected that. He trusted it. They graduated together in 1984, stayed close through their 20s, drifted into adjacent industries, my dad into operations consulting, Preston into finance, and eventually in 1993, they pooled everything they had to form Reyes Whitmore Partners. My dad contributed the operational expertise and the client relationships he'd spent 10 years building. Preston contributed startup capital and his connections in the investment world. It worked. By 1998, the company was billing $4.1 million annually. They had 11 employees, an office in the Loop, a legitimate thing they had built from nothing. My dad was 40 years old and he had made it. That was how he said it, not bragging. Just this quiet, private exhale of relief that his whole life had been building toward. I was 13 when I understood that things were genuinely good. We moved from our house in Berwyn to a larger place in Oak Park. My mom stopped working the second job she'd had since before I was born. My dad started talking about college funds and travel and the future in this expansive, unclenched way he never had before. I was 14 when it fell apart. In March of 2000, federal investigators arrived at the Reyes Whitmore Partners office on a Tuesday morning. They had warrants. They seized computers, files, financial records. They were looking for evidence of embezzlement, specifically the systematic diversion of $2.3 million from client accounts into a series of shell companies and offshore accounts over a period of 22 months. The money was gone. That part was not in dispute. What was in dispute was who had taken it. My father was arrested on April 14th, 2000. He was charged with wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. His bail was set at $500,000. We couldn't make it. He sat in county lockup for 6 weeks before his attorney negotiated a reduction. Preston Whitmore was not charged. He was interviewed extensively. He cooperated fully with investigators. He provided testimony. His testimony, which described a pattern of financial irregularities he claimed to have discovered and reported to the board, was a significant factor in the prosecution's case. My father's attorney believed from the beginning that Preston had set the whole thing up, that the transactions had been structured to leave a trail pointing at my dad's login credentials, his signature authority, his accounts, that Preston had known exactly what investigators would find when they came looking, because Preston had arranged it that way. But proving it was another matter. The trial lasted 11 days. My father testified for 6 hours. He was composed, specific, credible. He explained every financial decision he had made, every document he had signed, why he had done what he'd done, and what the legitimate business rationale had been each time. The jury convicted him in 4 hours. He was sentenced to 8 years, served 6 with good behavior. He came home in February of 2006. I was 20 years old and in my second year of college. I had gone home for the weekend, driven the 3 hours from Champaign to Oak Park, and I stood in my mother's kitchen when the car pulled up and my father walked through the front door. He had always been a solid physical presence, broad shoulders, a way of filling a room without meaning to. The man who walked in that February afternoon was 50 pounds lighter and 20 years older than the father who had been taken away 6 years before. He moved carefully, like someone who had learned that the world could hurt you in ways you never anticipated and who was not going to be caught off guard again. He never really came back. Not all the way. He was present. He was kind. He was, in his own diminished way, still himself. But something had been taken out of him that 6 years of incarceration had replaced with something harder and quieter and sadder. He died of a heart attack on March 3, 2013. He was 52 years old. The cardiologist said his heart had been under sustained stress for years, possibly a decade. Damage that had accumulated. I knew what had accumulated it. I had known for 13 years. My daughter Ivy was born in 2002. Her father and I separated when she was 4 and divorced when she was 6. A whole separate story and not the point. She grew up knowing that her grandfather had been in prison, knowing that something unfair had happened, knowing that the name Preston Whitmore was not to be spoken in my mother's house, but she was a child and then a teenager, and I had protected her from the full weight of it the way you do. You give children the simplified version, the safe version, the version that doesn't break something in them before they're ready. I had not anticipated needing to give her the full version at 23 over dinner at the man's own table. She had met Colton in September at a design conference in Chicago. She was finishing her master's in urban planning. He was a third-year architecture student at IIT. They were both 23, both ambitious, both earnest in that particular way that still young people are, when they haven't yet been seriously disappointed by anything. She called me after their second date and said, "Mom, I think this one might actually be it." I had been happy for her. She'd had a hard couple of years, a long relationship that ended badly, a difficult transition into grad school, a period of genuine loneliness she hadn't fully hidden from me. Colton had arrived at the right moment and seemed to be exactly what she needed. I met him for the first time over dinner at my apartment on a Thursday in early January. He was polite, almost too polite, the practiced kind. He shook my hand, complimented the apartment, asked about my work in healthcare administration, listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. All the right moves. But something was wrong. Not with anything he said or did. Something underneath it. Something I couldn't name. His eyes were green, sharp. They looked through things rather than at them. I pushed it aside, attributed it to the normal unease of meeting your daughter's new boyfriend at 49 years old. Told myself I was being protective and reading too much into nothing. Then after dinner, when Ivy asked how they'd met, he smiled. And in that unguarded, relaxed moment, the first moment all evening when he let the rehearsed version of himself step back, something else surfaced in his face. I recognized it immediately. I just didn't know from where. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake cataloging his face, the angle of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders, the particular quality of his self-assurance, which was not arrogance exactly, but something adjacent to it, an assumption of welcome. At 2 in the morning, I got up and went to the attic. The boxes were from my mother's house, transferred after she moved into assisted living 4 years ago. I knew roughly what I was looking for. I found it 20 minutes in, my old college yearbook from Illinois, 2000, the year I transferred out after my dad's arrest. I had kept it for reasons I couldn't fully explain. Inertia, probably. The way you keep things that hurt. Page 47. A group photo from a business school networking event, 1999. My father on the left, laughing at something, and third from the right, standing with the particular posture of a man who has always assumed he belongs in every room he enters. Preston Whitmore, age 38. Green eyes, that jaw, that way of holding himself. Colton was his son. I set the yearbook down on the attic floor and sat there for a long time. My phone was in my hand. I opened a browser, typed Preston Whitmore Chicago, found a LinkedIn profile in 40 seconds. Senior Managing Director at Hargrove Capital. Married to Diane. 2 children, Colton and Natalie. The room was very quiet. I went back downstairs, made tea I didn't drink, sat at my kitchen table and thought about my father's face in the courtroom on the last day of his trial, when the verdict was read and he turned to look at me and my mother in the gallery. He didn't look angry. He looked confused, mostly. Like a man who had just been told that the world operated on rules he'd never been given. Preston Whitmore had sat at the prosecution's side of the courtroom and said things that were not true, and he had done it calmly, and he had done it thoroughly, and he had gone home afterward and built a life, and now his son was dating my daughter. I thought about what to do for 3 days. I said nothing to Ivy. I went to work. I ate meals. I functioned. And then on a Sunday evening, Ivy called me. "Colton really liked you, Mom. His parents want to meet you. Dinner at their place, Saturday." I said yes. The drive out to Winnetka took 40 minutes. The neighborhood Preston lived in was the kind that communicates wealth not through display, but through restraint. Enormous houses set far back from the road, old trees, no clutter, the confidence of people who have nothing to prove. Ivy talked the entire drive, how successful Preston was, how warm Diane was, how Colton had grown up in this amazing environment and was somehow still completely grounded. She was nervous in the way people are when they want 2 things they love to get along. I listened. I said the right things at the right moments. I kept my hands loose on the wheel. The house was colonial, white columns, circular driveway. There was a fountain, turned off for winter. The whole property was immaculate in the way that requires a staff to maintain, not just effort. I thought about about our house in Oak Park, the one we'd had to sell in 2001 to pay legal fees? The front door opened before we reached it. Diane Whitmore was warm, attractive, mid-50s, with the carefully maintained look of a woman who takes her appearance seriously without appearing to try. She hugged Ivy, introduced herself to me, drew us both inside with the easy hospitality of a practiced host. Preston appeared from the direction of the kitchen. He was 62 now, gray at the temples, some weight around the middle, the kind of aging that happens to men who live comfortably and without much physical stress. But the eyes were the same, exactly the same as the photograph, exactly the same as the courtroom. They found mine immediately, and I watched it happen. The recognition, the recalibration, the decision, all in the space of less than 2 seconds. He had known my maiden name. He would have Googled me when Colton mentioned who Ivy's mother was. He had known I was coming tonight. "Amanda," he said warmly, extending his hand. "I've heard so much about you." I shook it. I don't know how. I felt nothing in my hands. Dinner was performed at a high level. Diane had made a rack of lamb. There was good wine, a 2018 Barolo that I could tell was expensive and which tasted to me like ash. Colton was attentive and charming and kept glancing between his father and me with something in his eyes that I had not initially been able to name. I understood it now. He was watching to see if anything happened. He knew something. Not everything, but something. Preston talked about his career with the practiced modesty of a man who has told the same story many times and has refined it to remove any seam that could be pulled. He mentioned the difficult early years in finance. He mentioned taking risks. He mentioned obliquely partnerships that hadn't worked out. He did not mention my father's name. "Started with nothing," he said, and looked at me. "Worked my way up through tough decisions." "Absolutely," I said. "Tough decisions shape us." After the main course, I excused myself to use the bathroom. The house was the kind of place where every room is deliberate, art chosen for its statements, furniture for its provenance. The hallway outside the bathroom had framed photographs of the family. Colton at his high school graduation, Natalie at what appeared to be a debutante event, family vacations in places that required long flights to reach. There was no photograph from before 2003. I noted that. I was stepping back into the hallway when Colton appeared from the direction of the living room. He stopped when he saw me. We looked at each other. "We should talk," he said quietly. "I don't think there's anything to talk about. You know who my father is?" His voice was low. "I saw it on your face when you walked in the door tonight." I looked at him for a long moment. He was 23. He had his father's jaw and his father's eyes, and I thought not yet his father's capacity for deception. The thing in his face right now was not confidence. It was something closer to dread. "Does Ivy know?" I asked. "No, I'd like to keep it that way." "I bet you would. This isn't what you think," he exhaled. "I didn't know. Not at first. Not until we'd been together about 6 weeks and Ivy mentioned your last name, your maiden name, Reyes, and I remembered." "Remembered what?" His jaw tightened. "There was a thing when I was a kid, a lawsuit or a trial or something. My dad had a business partner. I was 8 or 9. I remember there being a lot of tension, and then it was just over and we didn't talk about it. Ever. My dad's rule. And when you heard my maiden name and remembered that thing, what did you do?" He didn't answer right away. "You kept dating her anyway," I said. "I wanted to understand it first. I thought maybe I was wrong." "Were you?" He said nothing. "Your father framed mine," I said. I kept my voice level. I had been planning what I would say if I got this moment, and I had decided I would say it clearly, without drama, without cruelty, because clarity was the thing my father had never gotten, and I was not going to dilute it now. He embezzled $2.3 million from their company over almost 2 years. He structured the transactions to look like my father had done it. He testified against him in court. My father served 6 years in prison for something he did not do. He came home and he never really recovered. He died of a heart attack at 52 years old. Sustained stress, the cardiologist said. "That's what your father's decisions produced. That's the trail." Colton was very still. "Ask him," I said. "Look him in the eye and ask him if he framed my father." I walked back to the living room. Preston was describing something to Ivy. He looked up when I came in, read my face, looked past me to where Colton had appeared in the doorway behind me. He knew something had shifted. I watched him make the calculation. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Monday morning, I texted Colton one message. "I have things you need to see. We should meet." He replied within the hour. "Coffee. 5th and Erie. Tuesday at 2. I spent Monday night organizing the file. 23 years of documentation that I had been adding to, incrementally, obsessively, in the way that people add to things they cannot let go of. The original trial transcripts, the financial records from the discovery phase of the criminal case, a forensic accountant's report that my father's appellate attorney had commissioned in 2004, which identified specific anomalies in the transaction records, timestamps that didn't align, access logs that showed activity on my father's credentials during periods he could document he was elsewhere, IP addresses that didn't match. The appellate effort had gone nowhere. The court found insufficient grounds for a new trial, but the report existed. There were also the offshore accounts. My father's attorney had traced 2 of them, imperfectly, to structures that had no documented connection to my father, and a number of suggestive connections to a holding company that Preston had an ownership interest in, not proof, but a thread. And there were the emails. 14 of them, recovered from a backup server during civil litigation my father's estate had pursued in 2015. Internal emails between Preston and a financial consultant named Marcus Grief, written between November 1998 and February 2000. The emails were careful, oblique, written in language that allowed allowed for innocent interpretation, but read in sequence with the forensic report alongside them, they told a story. A careful, methodical, 22-month story. I put everything in a manila folder, organized with a one-page timeline at the front that any reasonable adult could follow in under 10 minutes. Colton was already there when I arrived. He was at a corner table, hands around a coffee he hadn't touched, wearing the face of someone who had not slept in 2 days. I sat down, ordered nothing, slid the folder across the table. "Read it," I said. "All of it. Then decide what you believe." He opened it, read the timeline, turned to the first set of documents. His face was careful, composed, controlled. He was his father's son in that, at least. But by the third page of the forensic report, his jaw had shifted. By the emails, he had stopped moving at all. He read for 41 minutes. "This can't all be real," he said finally. His voice was unsteady. "It's all real. Trial transcripts are public record. The forensic report was filed in federal court in 2004. The emails were produced in discovery in 2015. Everything in that folder has a document number and a source. You can verify every word of it." He looked up at me. His eyes were wet. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because my daughter deserves to know what she's walking into. And because you deserve to know who your father actually is." He sat with that. He went back to the file, cross-referenced dates, checked the names against things he clearly already knew. At one point, he pulled out his phone and I watched him type something. Check a result, set the phone face down on the table. "He was in London," Colton said quietly. "November 14th, 1999. There's an email here between him and Grief, timestamped 11:47 p.m. Chicago time. But I remember, I've heard stories about that trip. He brought us back British chocolates. It would have been the middle of the night in London." "Yes," I said. He closed the folder. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. I had thought about this too. I had thought about it for 2 days, and I had come to the same answer each time. "I want you to decide who you are," I said. "Are you his son, or are you your own person? You're 23. You still get to choose that, but you don't get to choose it while keeping my daughter in the dark." I left him there, at the corner table, with the folder and the cold coffee and 23 years of something that had finally been placed in front of someone who had the standing to do something about it. 2 days passed. I did not call Ivy. I did not reach out to Colton. I went to work. I drove home. I cooked dinner. I barely ate. I was waiting for something, and I didn't know what form it would take when it came. Thursday night at 8:47, my doorbell rang. Colton was standing on my porch. He had the look of someone who had been through something violent and survived it. Eyes red, face tight, the particular exhaustion that comes not from sleeplessness, but from sustained emotional weight. I confronted him, he said. My hands gripped the edge of the door. Tuesday night, after I left the coffee shop, I went home and I waited for him to be alone. My mother was at book club. He swallowed. I had the file. I had my phone with photos of the documents. I sat across from him at his desk and I put it all in front of him and I asked him directly. What did he say? He denied it. First, for about 20 minutes. Talked about how I didn't understand how these things worked, how business partnerships had complex failures, how my father's attorney had tried to pin things on him and failed, how the courts had decided. His voice was flat. Standard stuff. Very calm. Very practiced. But I kept going. Something shifted in his face. I had the emails. I had the timeline. I started asking specific questions. November 14th, 1999. The London trip. When he told me he'd been at a conference that week, I showed him the timestamp. He told me I was misreading the time zone. I told him I'd already calculated it 2 different ways. He exhaled. I kept asking. And eventually, it took about an hour. The practiced version ran out. I said nothing. My throat was closed. He admitted it. Colton said. Not everything. Not in those exact words, but enough. He said the company was heading toward a financial crisis, and he had made decisions to protect the family. He said my father, your father, was going to take it down, and he did what he had to do. He said he was sorry. 23 years. He said he was sorry, Colton repeated. It sounded like he still wasn't sure what to do with that. Did he say why he testified against him? He said by that point he couldn't undo it. He said once the investigation was pointed in a direction, he had to either confirm it or implicate himself. A long pause. He said he had a family to protect. The words landed exactly as they were intended to. I understood, finally and completely, the arithmetic of what had been done. My father's family had not been part of Preston's calculation. It had been a weight on the opposite side of the scale. We stood there on the porch for a while. I didn't invite Colton in. There would be time for that conversation, or there wouldn't, but not tonight. Are you going to tell Ivy? He asked. That's not a question you get to ask me, I said. That's not a negotiation you're part of. He nodded. He understood. I broke up with her, he said. This afternoon. I didn't tell her the full reason. I will, but I needed to talk to you first. I looked at him for a long time. That was the right thing, I said. He left. I stood in the open doorway for a while after his car pulled away. The February air was cold and the street was quiet, and somewhere behind me, inside the house I had built for myself over 23 years of starting over, my phone was going to ring soon. It rang 11 minutes later. Ivy, crying, confused, asking if I knew what had happened, if he had said anything to me, if there was something she didn't know. Come over, I said. I'll tell you everything. What followed was not simple or clean. Nothing like this ever is. Ivy arrived within the hour. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table where I had drunk the cold tea 3 weeks earlier, and I told her the whole story, not the simplified version, the full one. My father, the partnership, the embezzlement, the trial, the 6 years, the man who came home and the man who was taken away, and finally, the dinner in Winnetka, what I had recognized, and what Colton had ultimately done with it. She was quiet for a very very long time. You went to that dinner knowing, she said. Yes. And you sat there. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? Because I needed to see it with my own eyes. And because I didn't want you to feel what you're feeling right now until I was absolutely certain. She cried. Not the soft kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from grief and rage and the particular devastation of learning that something you thought was good was built on something rotten. She cried for a long time, and I sat with her. And I did not try to rush it or fix it or redirect it to something more manageable. Around midnight, she asked, "What happens now?" The question turned out to be larger than either of us anticipated. I called my father's original attorney the next morning. He was retired now, 74 years old, living in Sarasota, but he picked up on the third ring, and when I told him what had happened and what Preston had admitted to his son, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "We need to document that conversation." Colton, to his significant credit, agreed to make a formal statement. He retained his own attorney, a decision that took courage, I thought, given what it meant for his relationship with his family, and the statement he provided was detailed, specific, and included a recording he had made during the confrontation without telling his father. Illinois is a one-party consent state. The recording was legally obtained. I'm not going to overstate what happened next, because legal reality is rarely satisfying in the way that justice stories are supposed to be. My father was dead. The criminal statute of limitations on the embezzlement itself had long since passed. A posthumous exoneration was theoretically possible, but required a petition process that my father's estate would have to pursue, and the outcome was uncertain. What was not uncertain was the civil exposure. The recording alone created significant liability. Preston's attorneys, once they understood what existed, moved quickly to a settlement conversation. I won't discuss the specific terms. What I will say is that my mother, who is 81 and living in a memory care facility in Evanston that costs $9,400 a month, will not have to worry about that cost again. My father's name, Gerald Reyes, was restored, partially and imperfectly, through a filing in the federal court where he had been convicted. It did not make the newspapers. It was 2 paragraphs in a court document that almost no one read, but it exists. His name is in a record that says he did not do what they said he did. I went to the facility and told my mother. She held the piece of paper I had printed and looked at it for a long time. "He'll be glad," she said finally. She wasn't sure by that point that he was gone. I didn't correct her. The relationship between Ivy and Colton was over. She was clear about that, and I understood it. There was too much entanglement, too much that she would have to renegotiate every time she looked at him. She told me she didn't blame him. He had been a child when it happened. He had been kept in the dark, and when he found out, he had done the right thing. But doing the right thing doesn't erase the situation. It just means you're not adding to it. She's doing well. She's finishing her thesis on infrastructure equity in post-industrial Midwestern cities. She talks to me twice a week. She started dating someone new, a woman named Priya, who works in climate policy, and she called me one evening in a tone I recognized, excited, a little nervous, wanting me to be glad. I was glad. Colton sent me one message, 6 months after everything was settled. "I've been thinking about what you said, about whether I was my father's son or my own person. I'm still working on it, but I think I'm working on it in the right direction." I wrote back, "That's all any of us can do." I meant it. Preston Whitmore is still at Hargrove Capital. The settlement was confidential, and his professional life has not publicly changed. I spent some time being angry about that, and I imagine I'll spend more. But I've come to understand, slowly and imperfectly, that I was not going to get the ending where the full weight of what he did lands on him visibly and completely. That ending doesn't exist in the world I actually live in. What I got was this: my father's record corrected, my mother's care secured, the truth spoken aloud in a room by the man who had spent 23 years keeping it buried, and Ivy knowing all of it, the whole shape of what her family had been through, carrying it now as part of her story rather than a simplified version that protected her from something she had a right to know. I think about my father most on ordinary days. Not the big moments, his face in the courtroom, the morning he came home, the Tuesday afternoon in March when I got the call, the ordinary days, driving to work, eating dinner alone, sitting in the quiet of a house that is mine, that no one can take, that I made myself. He was a man who trusted completely and lost everything because of it. He spent 6 years in a place that broke something fundamental in him, and then he spent 7 more years living with what was broken, and then he was gone. He was 52 years old. I am 49. I think about that sometimes. How close I am to the age at which his story ended. How different my understanding is of the years he had left. What he might have done with them if someone had sat across a table from Preston Whitmore 23 years ago and put a folder full of truth between them and said, "Read it, all of it, then decide what you believe." My daughter brought home a boy who smiled like the man who stole my father's life. She didn't know that. She couldn't have. And maybe that's the thing I've had to sit with longest, that the instrument of finally getting some version of justice was a young man who happened to love my daughter, who happened to have a conscience, who happened to make a choice that cost him something real. It doesn't make any of it fair. It doesn't restore what was taken, but it happened. And my father's name, Gerald Reyes, age 41, an honest man who built something real, is in a record now that says he did not do what they said he did. He never lost a night of sleep over it, the man who did this, until his own son made him. I don't know if that's enough. Some days it feels like it is. Some days it doesn't come close. Most days I just keep going, which is, I think, exactly what my father would have wanted for me.